Okay, everybody, let's get it started hot. Let's get it started in here. Come on, come on. Actually, I think the proper lyrics to that song are let's get retarded. Let's get retarded in here. But we all know that that is not politically correct. It's actually funny. I think those lyrics were borderline not politically correct when they came out in the early to mid 2000s. But, you know, the Black Eyed Peas still doing their thing, baby. Still doing their motherfucking thing, baby. Um, what I wanted to discuss today is impeachment. So yesterday I might have said something incorrect. In fact, I'm certain I did. Not that that would be the first time, but I talked about impeachment. Everybody was under the impression that impeachment happened. Trump was impeached. In fact, many people might believe that today, but this detail is actually still up for debate. And let me tell you why. So I read a tweet by Mike Cernovich yesterday that said something about the impeachment not maybe being invalid or not valid if Pelosi doesn't send the articles of impeachment, which they voted on, to the Senate. So I am not a legal scholar, but Cernovich knows his legal stuff. If you doubt it, look up his credentials. He knows his shit. He said that, but he didn't go into too much detail. Then this guy named Noah Feldman wrote an article in Bloomberg, and this guy is, I believe he is a legal professor. Noah Feldman is a Bloomberg opinion columnist. He is a professor of law at Harvard University and was a clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Souter. His books include The Three Lives of James Madison, Genius, Partisan, President. Okay, so let's read a little bit here. This guy has an article titled Trump Isn't Impeached Until the House Tells the Senate. According to the Constitution, impeachment is a process, not a vote. He starts off, now that the House of Representatives has voted to impeach President Donald Trump, what is the constitutional status of the two articles of impeachment? Must they be transmitted to the Senate to trigger a trial? Or could they be held back by the House until the Senate decides what the trial will look like, as Speaker Pelosi has hinted? So yeah, Speaker Pelosi said that she was going to hold back the articles of impeachment from the Senate, probably until she could figure out how things were going to look in the Senate, which is a clever thing for her to do, whether or not it's allowed. And then he continues, the Constitution doesn't say how fast the articles must go to the Senate. Some modest delay is not inconsistent with the Constitution, or how both chambers usually work. But an indefinite delay would pose a serious problem. Impeachment, as contemplated by the Constitution, does not consist merely of a vote by the House, but of the process of sending the articles to the Senate for trial. Both parts are necessary to make an impeachment under the Constitution. The House must actually send the articles and send managers to the Senate to prosecute the impeachment. So the impeachment vote has to be prosecuted, it looks like. And the Senate must actually hold a trial. If the House does not communicate its impeachment to the Senate, which it hasn't actually impeached the president. If the articles are not transmitted, Trump could legitimately say that he wasn't truly impeached at all. That's because impeachment under the Constitution means the House sending its approved articles to the Senate, with House managers standing up in the Senate and saying the president is impeached. As for the headlines we saw after the House vote saying Trump impeached, those are a media shorthand, not a technically correct legal statement. So far, the House has voted to impeach Trump, future tense. Ah, ha, ha, ha. The House has voted to impeach him. He isn't impeached until the articles go to the Senate and the House member delivers the message. Once the articles are sent, the Senate has a constitutional duty to hold a trial on the impeachment charges presented. Failure for the Senate to hold a trial after impeachment would deviate from the Constitution's clear expectations. Very interesting. Very interesting. So, I don't quite know what to make of this. Let me take a sip from my warm water slash little mix splash of coffee. This is very interesting. So basically, it looks like Trump wasn't actually impeached. Now, there are different speculations as to why why House Speaker Pelosi is not sending this over to the Senate. Some people believe that it's because it's a waste of time. They know it's a waste of time. They know he will not be found guilty in the Senate. And so they actually never intended for the impeachment process to go forward. Some people believe that Pelosi only went through this impeachment nonsense to placate the more radical factions in the Democratic Party that needed something, like throwing them some red meat, because basically everything the Democrats have done trying to go after Trump has failed, right? They tried to go after his tax returns, fail. They tried to say he had businesses in Russia that affected his stuff, failed. They said that he worked with the Russians, collusion 2-year Mueller report, failed. Everything that they go after him for is they fail. And so now it's like, okay, they've been throwing all of this flack at Trump for a few years now, but they've been trying to take him out of office since the beginning, but they have failed at every single turn. So there's a lot of speculation, and this is just speculation, that it's possible Pelosi has run this damn thing just to placate to her base and to let people know, hey, we did something. Like, right, we did something. Trump is guilty of something, even though he's actually not guilty of anything that they've charged him with at the moment. It's so interesting how this is playing out. Now, I want to transition over to the media. So, what I thought was interesting in this article was how the author points out that it is the media saying Trump impeached is media shorthand. Now, see, that ain't media shorthand. If Trump is not actually impeached, this isn't media shorthand. This is media malfeasance. This is media propaganda. That's what it is. That's 100% what it is. Now, I wrote Trump was impeached because that's what I thought happened, right? But I am not a major media outlet with legal scholars and researchers and reporters on my fucking dole. So I was duped by the media. Now, I think that what the media is doing is tearing the country apart. And the fact that they wrote that Trump is impeached, and many people actually believe it now, even though technically it's so funny because you can't say he wasn't impeached because it's not that he wasn't, it just hasn't happened yet, though it could happen today. But essentially, the media is trying to spin this narrative and make Trump look as bad as possible. It's possible they're trying to make him look like he was impeached so that way it negatively affects his prospects for running for his reelection in 2020, which I think he will get. But I've had some interesting interactions with people on Twitter which demonstrate how the media and people's current line of thinking is so fucked up and skewed. So we'll pause for a break and then I'll go into details about that. So I've had some very interesting interactions with some people on Twitter over the last month or so. When I get on Twitter, I like to fuck around. I like to say funny things, look at, I don't know. I enjoy the whole spectacle, which is Twitter. What I've noticed, and I believe I'm starting to understand, is the idea of being possessed by ideology. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's something I'm starting to come up with in my brain, is that there's ideologies. What they do is they provide a script of belief, but also you get to see that play out in responses. So ideologies say, okay, with this issue, you need to think this. With this issue, you need to think about this. With this issue, you need to have this response, right? And so, like, a typical left-winger ideological response would be, man-made global warming is true. Trump, did illegal things on his taxes. Trump colluded with Russia. Trump did a quid pro quo with Ukraine. Basically, if you are a Democrat, if you're a hard lefty, you believe every single thing that the liberals say, and you have the thing is this, though, when someone's possessed by an ideology, which I got that idea from Jordan Peterson, he made the comment that you can, like, basically, by knowing one or two of their positions or beliefs, you can infer correctly, like with a high accuracy, the rest of their beliefs on many other issues. And you can see this play out in people's responses. So I got into a Twitter spat with somebody about a month ago about some shit that Cernovich said about immigration going on, about how Cernovich made a comment on Twitter about there possibly, violence breaking out into the streets regarding, it had to do with the cartels having more power, I think, in certain parts of the country than people really realize. And just imagine that there was something about the chaos that would happen if they unleashed some kind of street guerrilla warfare. And I agreed with this. And there was this dude that kept on, and it was so funny. So this guy, oh man, okay, I know exactly what it is. So let me go with this one first. This dude was engaging me, and when I said, I totally agree, and I said something else, then the guy responded with, this is what he responded with. We're talking about the fact that there are large amounts of illegal immigrants from probably South America and Mexico, like just large amounts that are here, that the cartels may have influence over, that they could cause some real problems in certain cities in the southern U.S. and probably other parts of the country. Like, I think that is probably a fact. Like, if they wanted to fuck some shit up, they probably could. Now, this guy, because he's possessed by ideology, instead of looking at what I wrote or looking at what Cernovich wrote, he responded with his own imaginary argument. And he said, your response is, not valid because the majority of migrants are not coming over from Mexico. And I kept having to hit this guy until he blocked me, which I'm very glad he did, because I was thinking about blocking him because he kept sidestepping the argument. And I kept saying, dude, we're not arguing about this. Like, I'm not saying that the rate of Mexican immigrants is higher than people overstaying their visas. I'm not making an argument about that. I'm simply agreeing with the notion that there are large numbers of illegal immigrants from Mexico that are probably tied to cartels. That's it. I'm not saying that there's 5 million. I'm not saying there's 100 million. I'm saying that there's probably enough that they could cause some damage in the streets. They could cause at least some terror, right? You only need maybe a few thousand, crazy motherfuckers to cause terror in a city. You don't need 20 million. 20 million's an army. 20 million's a country, right? You don't need that many to cause terror. You only need maybe a few hundred, a few thousand at the most. So that's what I'm referencing Cernovich. Cernovich didn't put a number, but this is what I'm thinking. It's like, yeah, the cartels probably have some influence around the United States. If they wanted to cause some shit, they probably could. But this guy, we're going back and forth, and the whole time, this dude is referencing imaginary conversations, imaginary arguments, and it hit me that what this guy is doing is that instead of engaging with the actual content of the argument, he can't address this situation. His mental models don't allow him to address the argument that there are large amounts of illegal immigrants from Mexico, many of whom are probably tied to the cartels, and that if they decided to go rogue in a city in the United States, they could probably cause some damage. Instead of addressing that possibility, he was addressing the ideological lines of his party, which are most immigrants are not coming over from Mexico currently, right? Which doesn't even address the fact, once again, that doesn't even address the fact that many illegal immigrants are from Mexico, right? Look at total magnitude, absolute magnitude. You're going to find lots of illegal immigrants from Mexico. That doesn't mean the rate of immigrants from Mexico is higher than other places at the moment or from 4 or 5 years ago. Doesn't mean that. But when you're stuck in an ideological mental prison, which I've talked about before, these people are in mental prisons. Like a socialist is in a mental prison. Everything is through the reference of whatever their ideological map is. So basically, this guy is attacking all this stuff. And it was crazy. It was so interesting. So what else this guy did is I made a comment about how we got started in an argument was I made a comment about American education. I said the American education basically stunts a person's development by 10 or 15 years. And what I was being provocative, but what I meant by that was that essentially the amount of time that people spend in school learning, just sitting in school, following rules, learning so much useless bullshit, that they could be out in the world working, learning life, figuring shit out when they're kids and teenagers. So then that way, when they're in their 20s, when they're in their mid-20s, they've already lived through, I know what it's like to go to work in a job that I fucking hate. You see what I'm saying? For, this many years. Or I know what it means to save money. I know the value of saving for the future. Or I know what it's like to go to this place or stay in this place or live here or live there. My reference to education was about this. That basically keeping people locked up in classrooms and then having people take out large amounts of debt to go to a college where they stay once again in a artificial environment funded by unsustainable levels of debt, that is stunting people's overall development. This guy responded with some bullshit about how what he did was he took my words and instead of asking me to elaborate, or instead of asking specifics about my tweet, he immediately disagreed and started talking about childhood psychological development. And then I just totally beat this guy into the ground because I just kept saying, dude, we're not even arguing the same point. You're making up arguments that I haven't even said. I didn't say shit about childhood psychological development, wasn't even referenced in my tweet. But this guy is set on an ideological framework, and he was using a lot of ideological points against what I was saying about education. And I honestly, because the guy wasn't being rude, he was just being annoying, I was very curious about some of his understanding, so I asked him a lot of questions, which he couldn't catch on to. That I was trying to figure him out while he was trying to attack me. But this guy was so brilliant that he looking at my tweets, he asserted that I must be a foreigner. I must have grown up in a foreign country, something like that. And so I played into it. I'm like, oh, interesting. What country do you think I was born in? Where do you think I grew up? Where do you think I went to school? And I think the guy never caught on until he went and watched one of my live streams that was on Periscope. And so then I think he felt probably embarrassed about it. But basically, this dude was making all of these assumptions about me, about my beliefs, because that's what ideological people have to do. Instead of looking at reality, instead of listening to what you say and reading what you write, if they actually do that, they run the risk of not understanding something or not knowing how to respond. So if somebody who's ideologically possessed reads or listens to something that you say or write, what they'll do is they'll reinterpret what you said or wrote into something that fits their scripted responses. This is also like NPC behavior, non-playable character behavior. Lots of people are like this. I actually just addressed some people on Twitter the other day. I had two people. It's so funny. Like, there are smart people on Twitter that will take you to task for sure. But there are also people that are just mindless as drone zombies. And so I had two people in the same day. Brett Weinstein. I talked about this the other day, made the comment about how women are not having the conversations they should be having, which is interesting coming from a man, right? Especially a white male in today's society, where he was saying that there's not enough talk about the biological, the biological limits on female reproductive abilities. Like, people just were not talking about it. And he's not saying, and this is exactly what I'm trying to say as well. It's so funny. Like, I'm not saying that that women cannot make a decision to go out and party and do whatever the fuck they want and not have kids. Like, that's perfectly fine. That's within your right. What I'm trying to say is that there's indoctrination with lots of young women. There's an indoctrination by the culture, by many parents, I think especially by lots of women who were not necessarily happy with their lives. They'll tell their daughters, oh, don't worry about dudes, go out, have your fun, whatever. But what's happening is that the conversation, there's not enough conversation of people saying, hey, have your fun, but let's also talk about the fact that, you are very limited in when you can have kids. Having kids is a special thing. And if it's something you want to do, you need to seriously consider that before you get to be 30 years old, right? And because once you get to 30, yeah, you could still have kids, but now you're going to be in a rush. Now you're going to be looking for a guy right then and there to settle down. And, you're already, by that time, you've developed possibly lots of bad habits that are, that you're going to have to maybe learn how to unlearn for a long-term relationship to have kids. Anyway, that's all. That's my position, because I think having a good, rational discussion about it would make both men and women, women and men, both come to the table and say, look, here's the situation, guys. Women don't have their whole lifetimes to fuck around, right? So don't try to fuck around with women like they have forever. Same thing with women. Hey, you don't have your whole life to fuck around, right? So keep that in mind and spend some of your time in your youth looking for those guys that are not just going to fucking ditch you as soon as the next hot girl comes around. You see what I'm saying? Like, because when you're a young chick, you can do that, but you can only do that for so long. So you should have that discussion, in my opinion. I'm a guy, I don't have to go through that. So there's obviously limits to my perspective, but I think it's a good conversation to have. Sorry I went into that diatribe. What I wanted to discuss was how somebody in that thread posted that they think a lot of older women, because of jealousy and resentment towards the younger women, basically feed them these lines, not feed them these lines, but feed them the ideology or feed them the thoughts, the seeds. They plant the seeds of the feminist ideas that don't worry about having kids, focus on your career, and you can worry about men and kids later when you're 35, right? When it's very difficult to have kids. So, that's what somebody wrote, and I wrote underneath it because I'm seeing this more and more. I haven't seen a whole lot of this personally. I have heard it. I just heard it the other day from my hairdresser. She's a very nice Vietnamese lady, but she had a few kids. She was from a big family in Vietnam, and she has told her daughter to not settle down until she's in her late 20s, right? Now, I don't think she's doing it out of jealousy or resentment, but there's lots of people who are telling their daughters, don't even worry about it till you're like almost 30 years old, which could be a huge mistake for a lot of people. Um, but it's also good for some people. Now, anyway, I wrote that yes, I agree. I think some of what's going on is driven by women that were never attractive to begin with or that always had problems that are now, you know, telling younger women in university, hey, just be like a man. You don't need to be a nice feminine woman because they weren't like nice feminine women. So they push that onto the other ladies. Now, what happens? So I wrote that. And then somebody underneath it, you know, just wrote, no, that's wrong. Nobody is taking advice from other people about having kids. The real issue, and see, this is ideology. This is straight ideological talking points. They said the real problem is the cost of having children. In the United States, there's no paid maternity leave, blah, 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 blah. That is a straight up ideological bent. Those are 100% talking points. And I mean, I pretty much dismantled that person's argument. I said, look, the cost of having a kid is a problem. Not going to disagree. The economy is not easy, right? It's not easy to save money. It's not easy to make money. But that's not the problem. It is a problem. It is not the problem. And then I just said, look, this is simple. You don't even have to do a bunch of data research. I said, it was easier to have kids. It was harder to have kids. It was harder and more expensive to raise kids in the past, and people had more kids. Just look up the data. Also, look at the data across societies. Poorer countries are the ones having more kids. You go to a place down in Mexico, you're more likely to find a family of probably 4 or 5 than come up to the United States, find a nice, wealthy, white family. They might have 1 kid, right? It's not about money. I said it's about culture and technology, and I truly believe that. Technology has enabled people to not have kids if they don't want to, and it's the culture that has informed people to act on that technology and not have the kids. Okay? It's like over in China, one-child policy. It's the culture and technology that brought them to the point of today with their demographic problems. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't wealth inequality, right? And that's what this person was trying to say. Then another person comments, because I responded and I said wrong. People had more kids in the past when it was more expensive and more uncertain. I said it's technology and culture, and the culture informs what people do with the technology. Then somebody underneath it responded to me and said, no, wrong. You know, it was easy. It was cheaper in the past. Nowadays, people can't. And get this. Another ideologically possessed person. They said, no, it was cheaper in the past. It said most people, on average Americans, can't even save $500 for emergencies. Then it moved on to the next ideological point, which was, and even though we're wealthier than before, most of that money is going to the top whatever percent. So, once again, those are ideological tropes. These are scripted responses that people learn to regurgitate when they're having conversations with people. Okay? So then I just responded and I said, oh, really? You're telling me that it was cheaper to have kids 100 years ago? How about 150 years ago? I said, then I responded, and then, I added on to that, how about 300 years ago? You're telling me that it was less expensive to raise a kid 200 years ago or 150 years ago than it is today? And people had more kids back then in those times? Right? Right? Because they didn't have the technology to limit birth control or to limit births. Now, they also didn't have the same technology to make people live as long either. But, you don't get the population explosions that you see across Europe and America from the 1800s without, you just don't see that and times were tough. That's what I'm trying to say. Times were tough, right? People were working many, many hours. People did not have nearly the same shit we have today. We have a lot more leisure time. Even when we're at work, like there's a lot of bullshit ass time at work. And so, things are comparatively tough to maybe 50 years ago, but they're a lot easier than they were 150 years ago. In my, at least from what I know. I mean, I could be wrong about that as well, but I believe that to be the case. So what I'm getting at with this conversation is that people, and what's funny is that I got no responses from them after that. Because what do you say? Like, what are you going to argue that pioneers homesteading the fucking frontier in Oklahoma in 1835 were wealthier and better off than some fucking, middle-class white person with one child? No, of course not. But people people figure shit out. Nowadays, people don't want to figure shit out, but that's another problem. Lastly, I was having a conversation on Twitter with somebody today. Another NPC, two NPCs popped up. And, Tulsi Gabbard did not vote for impeachment. She didn't vote against it, but she didn't vote for it. So people are going after her. And a lot of people are, making fun of her for being like a Russian asset or for whatever. And I legitimately was in a conversation with somebody who believed that Tulsi was, acting in favor with the Russians or and the person that was responding was using verbatim, and this is probably a liberal person, was saying things like, that she was basically a friend of despots like Assad and Putin, and that, Assad gassed his own people, and those rebels are not the terrorists, and this, that, and all kinds of things like that. And I thought this was super interesting because after, calling her out on some of her other things, I just had to say, look, the bottom line is, and there was a guy that kept going back and forth with her, and I kept trying to say, I said, dude, you don't get it. This chick is not thinking. This person is not thinking. They're not thinking about the problem. That's actually the whole issue with the media right now, is that people are just taking in what the media says. And even if they're getting it from multiple sources or cross-referencing their sources, nobody is putting any kind of filter on it themselves to go, is this evidence? Is there real evidence for this? Like, remember when ABC faked that news from Syria, where it was a live fire range and in Kentucky, and they said it was a bunch of Kurds getting bombed. Syrian Kurds getting bombed by Turkish forces after we pulled out. I mean, it was a media hoax. Just like I think when everyone said Assad gassed those kids and those people, it seemed like such a hoax. Like there was no proof that Assad did that. All we heard was, Assad gassed his own people. And then all we saw was the results of it. But we don't know who did it. We have no fucking clue. So I pointed that out to the person. But that's what I'm saying is, you can have the same arguments with somebody that align ideologically, right? Like you can, there's nothing wrong with that. But just make sure that you're not ideologically possessed. So that way you have to transform everything you read and hear into that ideological matrix. Otherwise, you're fucked. You're totally controlled. And I'm sure that there's plenty of ways that I'm faulted in the way that I think about these things, but you got to get out of that matrix. So anyway, that's all I got for today. Went on long enough already. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Taylor Space Stutch. Check out my blog, tstutch.com. Check out my Twitter, tstutch1. Email me, tayradio1@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. Pardon me, I'm a little stopped up today. This time of the year, sometimes you just catch a little something. Maybe you get a little cold, you get a little flu. I don't get flu shots because I ain't no bitch. Just kidding. If you get a flu shot, there's nothing wrong with that, dude. You're just a puss. Just kidding again. Anyway, in this episode, I'm going to talk about the not-so-impeachment. Some interesting twists are developing around the so-called Trump impeachment. I was caught off guard, and I think many, many others were as well. Also, I spend a lot of time talking about being stuck in the ideological matrix. So take a listen to my story of trying to free people from the matrix in the second half, or the second 2/3. So that is what I got in store for you today. Follow me on my website, tstouch.com. Email me, tayradio1@gmail.com. Subscribe on YouTube, Taylor Stutch. Thank you, and enjoy the episode.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast?